Thanks for tuning in to this episode of History's Greatest Battles. As always, subscribe and share this episode or podcast if you enjoy it. Some battles fill later generations with a sensation of honor and a desire to participate in such nobilities, well, as noble as warfare can be. Others, the more one studies and reads firsthand accounts, cause those same generations to shrink away and to find gratitude in the peace that they live with. One such battle is the Brusilov Offensive during World War I. Many historians believe it was the most successful campaign of all campaigns in the Great War, and it was an offensive that the Russian monarchy ordered. Of the battle, German soldier Wolfgang Ackermann later wrote, quote, "To permit burial of the dead, a temporary armistice was agreed upon. As usual, the soldiers who happened to be in reserve were ordered to perform this task. Practically no emotion was shown as the mutilated bodies were borne away. Each of us regretted he was not among the dead. We were hungry for peace, eternal peace. We could expect no other fate than that of those we buried. For those men, everything was over. For us, just beginning." Let's now experience the battles of the Brusilov Offensive.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 46, The Battle of the Brusilov Offensive, the 4th of June to the 20th of September, 1916. Russian forces, 1 million soldiers on the Southwest Front, with another 750,000 in reserve. Austro-German forces, estimated at 2.5 million soldiers. The Brusilov Offensive, Russia's final large-scale assault in World War I, is remembered as one of the most ferocious and strategically brilliant operations in all of military history. Its staggering intensity crippled not only the Austrian Empire, hastening its collapse, but also drained the Russian monarchy of its final reserves of strength, contributing to its ultimate downfall.
As the Great War erupted on the 4th of August 1914, the German generals, brimming with strategic arrogance, calculated that Russia's ponderous mobilization would delay its entry for weeks, if not months. Yet, in a thunderous display of unexpected vigor, the Russian juggernaut hurled its forces toward East Prussia in just 2 weeks, shocking the German high command. Hampered by disjointed leadership, the Russian advance failed to reach its full potential, yet it was ferocious enough to unnerve General Max von Prittwitz, the German commander. His nerve shattered. He was swiftly replaced by the formidable duo of Paul von Hindenburg and Erich von Ludendorff, who embodied ruthless precision and wasted no time preparing a vicious counterstrike. The result was nothing short of annihilation. At Tannenberg, from the 26th to the 31st of August, Hindenburg and Ludendorff orchestrated a crushing double envelopment, a masterpiece of military strategy that left the Russian army gutted, with 125,000 men either slaughtered, maimed, or taken captive. As if one disaster wasn't enough, 2 weeks later, Russian forces were shattered once again, hemorrhaging another 125,000 men in the blood-soaked marshes of the Masurian lakes. But Russia's woes did not end there. In late August, Austria, the faltering yet persistent ally of Germany, unleashed its armies from Galicia, striking at Russian Poland, the western territory of today's Ukraine, adding yet another front to Russia's overburdened war machine. Though the Austrians tasted fleeting success, their fortunes swiftly soured as they were driven from Galicia, teetering on the brink of collapse until the Germans, with their typical cold efficiency, swept in to rescue their beleaguered comrades. Thus began the grim pattern that would define the Eastern Front. Hindenburg, initially commanding a skeleton force, waged a relentless campaign against the sheer mass of Russian soldiers, orchestrating lightning-fast troop movements by rail to counter every Russian thrust with a tactical brilliance not yet seen on the battlefield. By year's end, Hindenburg had wrested control of vast swaths of Poland from Russia's weakening grip, adding to Germany's spoils of war. Undeterred by the brutal winter of 1915, Hindenburg unleashed fresh assaults, though these yielded modest gains. The Russians, undaunted and still tenacious, struck back with vengeance, particularly against their hapless Austrian foes. With the arrival of summer in 1915, the German war machine roared back again to life. In a merciless offensive, they hammered the Russians into submission, forcing the Tsar's beleaguered forces to relinquish Poland and the Baltic territories before autumn rains mercifully halted the slaughter. Grand Duke Nicholas, though forced to cede vast stretches of land, achieved the near impossible. His leadership, against all odds, kept his shattered armies from total annihilation. Yet in the corridors of power, there was little gratitude for his efforts. The Grand Duke was cast aside, exiled to the distant Caucasus to face the Turks, while the Tsar himself, in an ill-fated move, seized direct control of the Russian armies in late August. As the 1915 campaign drew to a close, Austro-German forces held firm, their iron grip stretching from the Baltic shores at Riga to the formidable Carpathian Mountains on the Russo-Romanian frontier. By late February 1916, Erich von Falkenhayn, the steely German chief of staff, launched a brutal siege on the fortress city of Verdun. His singular aim? To grind the French army into oblivion. Desperate to relieve the choking pressure of Verdun, France implored Russia to strike at the Germans, and in mid-March, Russia answered with an offensive at Lake Narok, but it was a disaster, yielded nothing but 100,000 dead or wounded. Meanwhile, in May, the Austrians unleashed a thunderous assault on Italian positions near Trentino. Reeling from the onslaught, Italy turned to Russia, pleading for an attack to ease the unbearable strain. The Russian generals, weary of endless battles fought at the urging of their allies, resisted at first, reluctant to sacrifice more for the distant struggle of others. They informed the Tsar bluntly that an immediate attack was impossible. The troops were exhausted, the supplies depleted. They needed time to gather strength for a decisive offensive later in the summer. Only one man stepped forward, General Alexei Brusilov, commander of the Southwest Front. New to his post and eager to prove himself, Brusilov seized the opportunity, determined to make his mark. Whatever Brusilov's motives, the Tsar issued his command, launch an attack, a vast one, spawning from the Pripyat marshes along the Polish frontier to the southernmost reaches of the Austrian line, 300 miles distant. Brusilov's bold initiative was met with hostility. His fellow generals, consumed by envy and bitterness, withheld supplies and weapons, leaving him with a meager stock of artillery. But Brusilov, undeterred, adapted. He would strike without the brute force of endless bombardment and craft a new form of warfare. The typical method, borrowed from the battlefields of France, was to hammer the enemy with days, sometimes weeks of artillery fire, pounding their positions into dust, hoping the defenses crumbled under the weight of their shells. But this strategy often backfired. The barrage, more often than not, served as a warning, telegraphing the location of the impending attack, allowing the enemy to shift reinforcements and strengthen their lines. Worse still, the relentless shelling turned the battlefield into a hellscape of craters and churned earth, making it impossible for the attacking force to advance swiftly. Meanwhile, enemy reserves approached on solid, undamaged roads, ready to strike back. Even when the trench defenders were battered into submission, the chance to exploit such gains often slipped away. But Brusilov, stripped of overwhelming artillery, found fortune in adversity. He devised a method to break the stalemate that had crippled so many before him. Brusilov trained his men in tactics far ahead of their time, tactics that the Germans themselves would later adopt on the Western Front. He abandoned the suicidal waves of infantry charges and formed specialized assault units, each with a singular focus, to seize critical points of the enemy's defenses with surgical precision. These elite units would tear open the strongest defensive positions, clearing a path for the main infantry to advance unmolested by the usual storm of enemy fire. On the 4th of June, Brusilov unleashed his offensive. The artillery barrage, brief but violent, shattered the silence. It was not the prolonged prelude the Austrians had expected, and its brevity concealed the deadly strike that was about to come. Lulled into complacency by the absence of mass troop movements or the thunder of a sustained bombardment, the Austrians were caught entirely off guard. Brusilov's forces surged forward, striking at their unprotected flanks with a brutality. Brusilov's troops struck with unrelenting fury at the seams between Austrian armies, targeting their weak points. The result was nothing short of catastrophic for the Austrians. The 4th and 7th armies crumbled under the assault, their ranks disintegrating in the face of the Russian onslaught. In the north, Russian forces ripped through a 60-mile-wide front south of the Pripyat marshes, driving the Austrians before them. In just the first week, they surged 25 miles into enemy territory, in a war where seizing the length of a mere football field was seen as a success. Their momentum, unstoppable. To the south, the Russians smashed through Austrian lines, hurling them back across the Dniester River and pushing toward Czernowitz, the capital of Bukovina. The Austrians now stood on the edge of collapse, their defenses buckling under this relentless Russian pressure. Yet Brusilov's triumph became his curse. His fellow commanders, seething with envy, refused to follow his lead. Despite orders to attack the German positions north of the marshes, they held back, leaving Brusilov to face this gathering storm alone. The treachery gave the Germans precious time. They swiftly moved an entire army south, reinforcing the Austrians and plugging the gaping holes that Brusilov had torn open. The Russian advance had been so rapid, so overwhelming, that Brusilov's forces were forced to slow, not by enemy resistance, but by the sheer logistical challenge of keeping their supply lines intact as they surged ever deeper into enemy territory. But this pause proved fatal. It coincided with the arrival of German reinforcements in large numbers, their movements swift and efficient, aided by railroad. The Tsar, belatedly realizing the urgency, commanded his other generals to send reserves to Brusilov's aid, but the crumbling Russian road system could not compete with German rail. Time was running out. At this critical juncture, Brusilov revealed a fatal flaw in his understanding of his own triumph. He did not grasp the revolutionary brilliance of his tactics. Had he paused to consolidate his gains, to regroup, and strike again when the moment was ripe, history might have taken a different course. Instead, emboldened by the Tsar's promise of fresh ammunition, Brusilov reverted to the old, tired tactics, hammering the enemy lines and the very ground beneath them with relentless artillery barrages, as if brute force alone could sustain the advance. He resumed the deadly, wasteful practice of mass infantry charges, sending wave after wave of men into the teeth of German fire. Predictably, the losses mounted, each assault more costly than the last, his army bleeding profusely on the battlefield. By early September, Brusilov's forces had clawed their way to the rugged foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. But here, nature itself joined the battle. The imposing terrain halted his advance as surely as the enemy soldiers entrenched before them. Reinforcements streamed in from across the front, not just from Germany's northern lines, but from the blood-soaked fields of Verdun in France. Their arrival slammed the door shut on Brusilov's offensive, stopping the Austrian retreat and exacting a terrible toll on the exhausted Russian soldiers. By the 20th of September, Brusilov's army had reached its breaking point. The momentum was gone, and exhaustion, compounded by relentless enemy counterattacks, brought the once glorious Russian advance to an absolute grinding halt. What had begun as an astonishing success had now turned into a poisoned victory, the staggering costs undermining the gains that had once seemed still within reach. Exact numbers remain elusive, but modern scholars estimate that Brusilov's campaign cost Russia at least 1 million men, perhaps as many as 1.25 million, either dead, maimed, or taken captive. The Austro-Germans suffered a similarly horrifying butcher's bill, their ranks gutted by the carnage. Brusilov's offensive, despite being Russia's most successful operation of the entire war, claiming more territory than any other, came at an unsustainable cost. The staggering losses cast a long shadow over the fleeting triumph. By the time Brusilov launched his offensive, the Russian armies were already hemorrhaging from prior campaigns. Since 1914, they had suffered a staggering 5 million casualties, and the human cost was mounting with each passing day. The Russian infantry, battered by years of slaughter, had reached their limit. Whispers of dissent filled the trenches. Sharp words of discontent aimed at the Tsar and his generals from the lofty halls of power down to the lowest ranks of cannon fodder. The Romanov monarchy, teetering since the revolution of 1905, now faced an even greater threat. Rebellion was brewing, not just among the people, but within the army itself, a force that had once been its pillar of strength. By spring of 1917, revolution erupted. Brusilov's offensive did not ignite it, but the colossal losses from the campaign had poured fuel on the already smoldering fires of discontent. The cost of Russia's greatest military success had, in the end, been a fatal blow to the empire. The Austrians fared little better. Their army, already crumbling, was slowly absorbed into the iron grip of the German war machine. By the end of Brusilov's offensive, Austria's military had been reduced to a puppet, its independence nothing but a hollow memory. German reinforcements had kept Austria from total collapse in 1916, but the weakness laid bare during the campaign sealed the fate of the Habsburg monarchy in Vienna. The empire was now on borrowed time. Austro-Hungary, the last of Europe's great continental empires, was a fragile mosaic of ethnicities bound together only by the might of its military, and that military was now in tatters. With the army weakened beyond repair, the empire's grip on its restless populations loosened. Decades of simmering ethnic tensions exploded into the opening, heralding the disintegration of the Habsburg Empire at Versailles in 1919, and the birth of new nations in southeastern Europe. In the immediate aftermath, Brusilov's early triumph lured Romania, previously a bystander, into the Allied fold, seduced by the illusion of Russian strength. Yet Romania squandered this opportunity, embarking on ill-conceived and poorly coordinated operations, heedless of broader Allied strategy. The result was an utterly tragic waste of its soldiers and resources. So weakened was Romania by its reckless actions that Bulgarian forces easily swept in from the south, overrunning the country by the dawn of 1917. The ripples of Brusilov's campaign reached the Western Front too. Chief of Staff Falkenhayn, compelled to siphon troops eastward to salvage Austria's crumbling defenses, saw his grand design to obliterate the French at Verdun fall apart. Falkenhayn's failure at Verdun, compounded by the chaos unleashed by Romania's entry into the war, led to his downfall. He was dismissed from his position and sent east, a relic of a crumbling command. In Falkenhayn's place rose two titans of German military might, Hindenburg and Ludendorff. As chief of staff and quartermaster general, they would wield unparalleled power, not only commanding the German military, but by war's end, controlling the very machinery of the German state. With Hindenburg and Ludendorff seizing the reins of power, Kaiser Wilhelm faded into the background. In the end, the Brusilov Offensive had a hand in toppling not one, but three monarchies, those of Russia, Austro-Hungary, and soon enough, Germany itself.